So um, this word relational, I mean, today all kinds of disciplines are suddenly renaming themselves as relational. There's relational sociology, there's relational psychotherapy, and so on. Well, in psychoanalysis, the relational turn was marked in 1983 with the work of publication of Mitchell and Greenberg's epic work, Object Relations in Psychoanalytic Theory. So, despite me having studied this work over 25 years ago and studied it quite deeply and been heavily influenced by it, it was only relatively recently that I began to think of myself as belonging to this grouping. So in what follows, I'll not be giving you a survey of the relational field, rather I'll be telling you about my personal journey in how I came to be here. So it was just a few years ago that I slowly started to become aware that my practice as a therapist had changed quite a lot. I started to become conscious of a sort of growing differences with some of the conventions that some of my colleagues took as unquestioned givens. Now, these conventions and the worldview from which they emerge, for the purposes of this talk, I'll characterize as the analytic. Now, I was a bit embarrassed by my diverging and divergent form of practice, and I kept it to myself for some time. I was pretty sure I'd be judged as having become casual and careless, of having become slack and lazy, of having lost my analytic way. And indeed, to some degree, I thought this too, that I was getting away with something shameful under the cover of darkness. But to say my way of working makes it sound like I made a conscious decision about changing my ways of working. This was not the case. I had slowly, without realizing it, drifted off-piste. And because the shift was born of unconscious drift, there are grounds for the view that I had not found a way, rather I had lost my way. Anyhow, found or lost, despite all this, I began to have some conviction in what I was doing and a bit braver about speaking out my differences with some of these taken for granted givens. I then rediscovered, as it were, for yet another first time, hiding in plain sight, a whole other world, outside the sort of analytic regime that prevailed, and I would argue still prevails, in the UK context. The name of this alternative view was relational psychoanalysis. And this worldview positioned itself explicitly against the classical analytic paradigm, the one I was finding myself at odds with. Now, my rendition of the prevailing norms in our community has caused some affront in some quarters. For example, when I put in a paper last year into group analysis, which was about a view on our trainings, two of the referees took umbrage with this. One saying, it certainly needs to be proven that many group analysts work nowadays like the so-called classical analyst. And another said, the critique of the so-called classical analyst might still be appropriate for some orthodox Kleinians, but does not fit with the present practice of many psychoanalysts who adopted the intersubjective turn with its emphasis on mutuality, exchange, and co-construction, especially American relational psychoanalysts, very well take into account context factors. However, once the paper was actually published, an email sent to me from a person currently in trainings struck a different note. This person said, I've just started the qualifying course and many of the issues you bring up resonate with me as I journey through the course. But in making the opposition relational and analytic, I have to some degree produced a false dichotomy. False because of the implication that those who are relational are not analytic and those who are analytic are not relational. The fact that the term relational psychoanalysis includes both invites the following refinement, that the distinction ought to be between that of classical psychoanalysis and relational psychoanalysis. However, for reasons that will become apparent, I intend to stick with the relational analytic dichotomy. The other problem with the dichotomy is that it obscures the differences that exist within each category. There are varieties of the relational and varieties of the analytic. For example, in different ways and to different degrees, the object relationists Klein, Winnicott and Fairbairn would all perhaps consider themselves as relational because they all concur with the view that individuals are necessarily related to other individuals from the first moments of existence. However, the form of clinical practice that they engage in, to my mind, is singularly non-relational. The relationist Irving Hoffman thinks similarly when he says, ego psychology, object relations theory, self-psychology and interpersonal theory, despite their varied and rich contributions, have perpetuated the positivist aspects of Freudian theory, even while, in many instances, disclaiming it. So this is why I retain the distinction between the analytic and the relational. And my thesis, my argument today, is this: that even though many colleagues might subscribe to a relational view of life, their form of clinical practice is antithetical to it. So that's what I'm going to argue. Now, what I'm calling the classical analytic attitude is one in which the analyst takes themselves to be a detached, objective observer of clinical phenomena. The primary purpose of the analysis is the disinterested scientific pursuit of truth. In this way, the classical psychoanalyst subscribes to the values and methods of positivist science, which construes of scientific practice and the knowledge it generates as objective and value-free. This is not my construal of the classical analyst. Rather, this is what is advocated and put forward by the classical analysts themselves. It is the deliberate intention of the classical analyst to be non-relational. To their way of thinking, to get caught up in relating would be to compromise the scientific integrity of the treatment. This scientific stance emanated in the first place, as you will know, from Freud himself. He thought of himself as a scientist and the project of psychoanalysis as a scientific inquiry. The resolute focus of this inquiry is the internal world of the patient. But it was not always so. Again, as would be familiar, I'm sure, to all of you, in his earlier theorizations, Freud gave actual experiences, say abusive parents, a significant role in the creation of neurosis. But then he came to think that the sources of neurosis were not in fact, but in fantasy. And this fantasy was thought to be generated by the psychological correlate of the conflict between the endogenous instincts. Henceforth, it was psychoanalytic blasphemy to give any credence to the idea of that actual external events played a role in the creation of neurosis and psychological distress. When analysts found themselves seduced by this error, it was regarded by the profession as an acting out. The profession as a whole followed him into this turn, where many remain marooned even to this day. So, if you think about psychoanalysis as a science, what does a science look like? And I'm putting it specifically in that language. So, schematically, one can describe psychoanalytic technique as follows. The psychoanalyst observes the patient's characteristic forms of distortion of external reality and uses this to construct interpretations and hypotheses about the structure of the patient's internal world. You could say the analyst measures the patient's distortion of the external world. Say the patient says the room is stuffy, by contrasting the patient's version with the analyst's version. This is not the case. So the analyst uses this distortion to make interpretations, which are not only descriptions of reality, but also crucially included in the interpretation is the reason that explains how and why the distortion has come about. Now, the first problem is evident. The patient's narrative mostly refers to events that are beyond the direct experience of the analyst, and so the analyst cannot know the patient's experience in any objective sense. So this is why, then, the frame of the experiment is moved firmly from there and then into the here and now, and specifically the patient's distortion of the analyst. This kind of distortion we know as the transference. The analyst now uses his or her experience and self-knowledge, they have to know themselves, to gauge the extent of the patient's distortion of the analyst. The analyst treats his or her subjective experiences as data and uses them to make inferences about the patient's psyche. This data we know as countertransference. Now, integral and essential to this scientific method is the assumption that the analyst's presence is a constant, which is another way of saying that it need not be included in the analysis. Now, this assumption is exactly where the relational ethos parts ways with the classical psychoanalytic. The analytic methodology claims to present the patient with a blank slate, and the patient then fills in the blank with material from their internal worlds. Whilst this is true to some degree, the method doesn't take into account the effect of being faced with a blank. The orthodox account has a linear conception of cause and effect. The patient is the cause, and whatever is provoked in the analyst is the effect. The analyst feeling sleepy is a consequence of the state of the patient's internal world, or being caused by some projection emanating from the patient. Well, the relationists say that the analyst cannot not participate in the analytic process. The analyst necessarily has an influence on the proceedings. Whatever is taking place in the consulting room, it is being co-created by all those present in the room. Now, the progenitor of group analysis, Foulkes, was well aware of this when he said, "Every interpretation has transference implications, and for that matter, countertransference implications. The mere fact that the therapist responds to material by interpreting it has considerable transference implications. Similarly, the absence of response on his part." On this basis, Foulkes, in his radical incarnation, is also relational. Radical Foulkes was clear that whatever the therapist does or does not do, it will necessarily have a consequence for the therapeutic encounter. With this in mind, he says, "It is important for the therapist to admit that his personal influence is inevitably strong, in spite of all his precautions to minimize this. Therefore, he should use it consciously rather than haphazardly or unconsciously." What does he mean by this? In what sense should one use one's influence consciously? I'll park this question and come back to it in the later part of this talk. Well, as I was writing, I noticed that I was tending to use the terms relational and social interchangeably, as though they were the same thing. So I want briefly just to attend to this distinction. The significance of the social, the idea of the social, is brought to light by contrasting it with individualism. To this way of thinking, the individualist way of thinking, the individual exists first, and secondarily they join together with other individuals to generate the social and society. The difficulties of social life now are thought to be caused by projections of the difficulties residing in the internal worlds of these individuals that are interacting with each other. Meanwhile, according to Elias Foulkes and others, the social exists prior to the individual. Each individual is born into a pre-existing social, and so the social is already a part of their unique individualities from the very first moments of their existence. Importantly, the social is constituted by and is an expression of power relations, and so our psyches are constituted by power relations too. We are born into multiple discourses which we unknowingly imbibe and form the basis for the ways we come to think about and experience the world. From this it follows that our perceptions and theories, however objective we think them to be, are intrinsically compromised by the ideologies one is constrained by. Ideologies are the rationalized self-interests of the more powerful. The ideologies behind the social construction of a particular version of reality can partially be revealed through a socio-political deconstruction, which allows other versions of reality to come into view. So a little thing now on the relational. Similarly, in the individualist account, individuals exist first, and then secondarily they relate to each other. In the relational paradigm, that which relates, the individual, emerges out of the relationship. In other words, and counterintuitively, the relationship is prior to that which relates. Or to put it in another language, intersubjectivity is prior to subjectivity and objectivity. I think maybe it is possible to conceive of the relational as the social made manifest at a local level, in which case it is clear that the intersubjective field is also constituted by power relations. The notions of intersubjectivity speak more directly into the realm of psychology. But in some renditions of intersubjectivity, it is spoken of as though the intersubjective field existed in a sociological vacuum, and so it makes no mention of power relations. The point is important because the absence of power relations from the discussion would make it appear that all persons have equal status and are affected uniformly by the intersubjective field. Now, these versions of the social and relational, they find a ready home under the umbrellas of postmodernism and post-structuralism. Post-structuralists hold that any attempt to fix meaning is subverted by the ambiguities, both within the object of study and within the interpreter herself or himself, as well as multiplicities, paradoxes, and irreducible inconsistencies that undermine foundational theories and preclude definition and foreclosure. Meanwhile, postmodernists argue that reality and subjective experience are always co-constructed events and as such are open to socio-political analyses. And yet, we humans are not just pawns of social forces. We are also Kantian beings, capable of acting and not just reacting. We are free to choose, but the possibility of manifesting our choices are deeply constrained by the discourses that we are born into. But more, our very choices are to a large degree shaped by these self-same discourses. This was also Marx's contention when he said this: men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted from the past. We're speaking here of recursive processes, of each feeding into and creating the other, even whilst each is being similarly created. This recursive process is more profound than the more straightforward one of constraint. Because the idea of constraint retains the individual social divide. And it feeds into the myth that we are all potentially autonomous individuals that are constrained by social forces coming from outside us. The better term is that of enabling constraints. That which constrains us also forms us, and which we also form. This complicates the simple picture of individuals exercising their Kantian autonomy, because now autonomy itself, agency, is shaped by these self-same enabling constraints. We form, even whilst in the same moment we are being formed. We are part of it, and it is a part of us. This sort of paradoxical rendition of existential reality, despite it being materialist, sounds not so far from that of the mystics. Both mystics and postmodernists are of the view that objective reality cannot be directly accessed. However, their way of understanding why this is so differs, as is each of their ways of dealing with this predicament. For the mystic, the reason that objective reality cannot be accessed is because it does not exist. They declare that experience to be Maya, illusion, and that one needs to join with it, to become it, to know this to be the case. This is a state of nirvana, where desire ends and the state of enlightenment is achieved, where distinctions between being and not being have no meaning. It is an experience of oneness and at the same time of nothingness. Existence is and is not. It is paradoxical. Meanwhile, the postmodernist says that we can never make any claim about objective reality, because our experiences are always informed and formed by the discourses we inhabit. Because we are immersed forever within ideology, and we can only ever experience the world through its veil, we can never access objective reality. Now, the postmodernist solution to this existential predicament, in which nothing can be taken at face value, even one's own thoughts and experiences, is to strike up an attitude of irony towards all claims of knowledge, and more importantly, towards all experience. All things can be and are deconstructed, including the one doing the deconstructing. Irony looks at experience and asks, with a raised eyebrow as it were, really? Let's look at why you come to think this to be the case. And there's a real virtue in this kind of questioning, as it opens things up to expose the hidden workings of power relations, ideology, and self-interest. However, it can also lead to a situation in which existence and experience is ultimately rendered shallow and nihilistic, because it leads to a sterile version of relativism in which anything goes. Ultimately, irony is a form of detachment. And this is where I part ways with this version of postmodernism. I broadly subscribe to the postmodernist version of its existence and the predicaments it gives rise to. But I also think that there is an objective reality beyond me, even though I am only able to access it in the limited and distorted ways that I have just been describing. In this sense, I am a critical realist, in that I think I can say things about objective reality, even whilst I realize that what I say is always problematic and is always open to revision. On this basis, I want to argue for another sort of stance in relation to this existential predicament, another stance from that of ironic detachment. I want to argue, instead, for a form of commitment in the face of radical uncertainty. And this in turn will require of the analyst a deep form of reflexivity and engagement rather than detachment. It will require of the analyst a deep form of involvement, so much so that it will bring into question whether we should retain the very categories of analyst and treatment. So, given that the relational ethos is of the view that there is no one royal road to therapeutic success, and given that it takes a strong stance against the very idea of generalizable technique, J. Greenberg points out that there's a surprising uniformity in the relational literature about the trajectory followed by treatments. The story in each of the examples he gives are as follows. After a period of work, the analysis comes to an impasse, which gives rise to unbearable tensions and anxieties in both protagonists. Under intense pressure, the analyst unwittingly exposes something of their own person in ways that the orthodoxy would construe as an acting out and analytic failure. For the relationist, however, this is not acting out, but a necessary unconscious enactment, in which the analyst is triggered into some action that is revealing of their person. This enactment, which shocks all parties, is followed by some sort of working through, which frees the process to continue in more productive ways. Greenberg suggests that there's a growing implication in the relational literature that this is how all good analyses should proceed. There will be a crisis, there will be an enactment, the resolution of which is the therapy. Greenberg says that this starts to look suspiciously like a relational royal road. The sample list that Greenberg provides includes instances of the analyst admitting to the patient that he has lied to her and then enlists her collaboration in understanding his reasons for doing so. Another confesses her erotic feelings for her patient. Another recognizes his patient as cold and brings her a blanket. Another puts his face in front of his patient and screams, "Shut up!" When Hoffman... Any of you done that? You're not confessing as yet. This is what the day is about. He cites another example to do with Hoffman, which is that when Hoffman's training patient insisted on sitting face to face, and she asks him whether it's absolutely necessary to use the couch for the analytic process, Hoffman replies, "Well, I don't know about the process, but it might be necessary for me to graduate." Well, whilst reading this, it occurred to me that the contemporary codes of conduct of this institute, the Institute of Group Analysis, its affiliates, as well as pretty much every psychotherapy and counselling institution in the UK, would deem each of these practitioners to have acted unethically in each of these situations. They would be charged with gross professional misconduct and be heavily censured. In part, this is because our profession is becoming more and more bureaucratized, and consequently, its values are becoming increasingly aligned with the litigation-phobic, defensive, command and control ethos of bureaucracies generally. The ethos that is being promoted is increasingly positivist and accords with what Schoen has called technical rationality, in which professional activity consists in instrumental problem solving made rigorous by the application of scientific theory and technique. I would in fact want to make the correction, made allegedly rigorous by the alleged application of scientific theory and technique. But that is a topic for another day. My point here is that whatever the intention of the codes, there's a real danger that the ways that they are worded, they end up outlawing relationists of this hue. So let me now turn to my way of working, my ramshackle cut and paste version of the relational. I want to stress again that it was not the case that I learnt a relational methodology which I then put into practice. Rather, my way of working and my way of thinking about the work which I have drifted into, has affinities with what I discover to be the case in the relational streams. Well, my first problem is that to announce my ways of working suggests that I have a way of working. Well, I do, of course, to some degree, but this way of putting it makes me nervous, as it starts pinning me down to something that might well suit one context, but not another. The primary reason I call my ways of working relational is because I think it is the relationship itself that is potentially therapeutic. Well, you are likely to be singularly underwhelmed by this revelation. To say this is hardly newsworthy. But it is not simply the fact of the relationship that makes it therapeutic, but the kind of relationship that is fostered. It is the depth, quality, and nature of the relationship that makes it significant. The classical analyst also has a relationship to the patient, albeit one that is hierarchical, detached, and emotionally closed off. The analyst is trained to take up a stance of neutrality, of emotional reserve, of abstinence, of not gratifying any of the emotional demands of the patient. All this is in the service of not muddying the transferential waters. In contrast, the kind of relationship I am inclined to develop has connotations with engagement, reciprocity, and mutuality, and is often very muddy and muddled indeed. But in subscribing to the values of reciprocity and mutuality, I am not doing away with the fact that it is the well-being of the ones who come for help that is central to the encounter, not mine. The therapeutic relationship is and remains a deeply asymmetric, patterned by the power relations and roles and functions of the ones who come for help, and me, the one who is employed to help. Well, it follows from the preceding discussions that my perceptions are, amongst other things, partial, imperfect, compromised, subjective, partisan, defensive, self-serving, value-laden, and ideologically driven. There is no neutral objectivity to be found here, but it is all I have. This is equally true of the ones who come for help. The therapeutic encounter is emergent, non-linear, and therefore it is unpredictable. I do not know what responses will be called out by my gestures, responses in myself as much as in others. What gestures and what these gestures will call out in turn. I am constantly being caught out by the thoughts and feelings that emerge unbidden in me. What should I do then, caught as I am in muddle and darkness? I begin my answer to this by recalling Foulkes' statement cited earlier. He says, when he said, it is important for the therapist to admit that his personal influence is inevitably strong, in spite of all his precautions to minimize this. Therefore, he should use it consciously rather than haphazardly or unconsciously. Well, nothing in Foulkes' writings would suggest that he means that the therapist should use their influence deliberately in the service of manipulation. To do this would be unethical, as it would be doing something to the patient without their knowledge or consent. I think what he meant, or might mean, I should say, is found in another place where he says this. He says that the therapist should have the courage to be his natural self. I find affinity with this idea of natural self, but I want to distinguish it from the notion of a true self, which arises out of the essentialist, asocial vision of the Romantics. I take natural to mean unadorned, and unadorned by the mystique that cloaks the classical analyst. This mystique is actively produced by many of the norms of what is thought to be good analytic practice. For example, to habitually meet and greet the client impassively. Another is the practice of entering a group room, uttering no word, looking at no person, only the floor. Then there's the convention of speaking in a disembodied voice in the objectivist language of a third person, and so on. None of these practices are natural, in the sense that this is not how one would normally behave on meeting other human beings. And if one did indeed behave like this, then one would give the impression of being somewhat disturbed and rather peculiar. Well, we habituate our patients into accepting these peculiar behaviors as meaningful. And if they do not comply and find the situation so created disturbing and troubling, then their response is readily interpreted as some resistance and difficulty emanating from within them. Dennis Brown once said to me that in his view, one should extend the same courtesies to patients as one would to a guest in one's home. I agree. But even here there remains the distance engendered by the formalities required of guest and host. For this reason, I'm inclined to go further, past courtesy, towards familiarity and authenticity, and if we are lucky, intimacy. As to why I think this to be a good thing, I'll come to later. But how to get there, when I do not even know in which direction it lies, and even if I did know, what would I need to do to start heading in that direction? In this way, I am in a state of radical uncertainty, radical ontological uncertainty about the status of everything, including my very thoughts and feelings and experiences. But this rational uncertainty, although genuine, is of a particular and peculiar kind. It is the kind of uncertainty that afflicted Descartes and made him doubt everything but his own thought. The postmodernist critique is so powerful precisely because it says to Descartes that he cannot rely on his thought either because it is already infiltrated. It was the same kind of deep rational uncertainty that famously drove the younger Wittgenstein to insist in Bertrand Russell's study that they could not be certain that there was not a rhinoceros in the room. And I was reminded of this when I'm seeing somebody who's very, very paranoid. His lived experience is of being the subject of a global conspiracy that is tracking his every move. On the occasions I have said that I do not think this to be true and my reasons for it, he would riposte, but how do you know? All and any rational evidence I could put forward can always be torpedoed by this question. How do you know? But this kind of profound uncertainty is peculiar because it only arises by virtue of having amputated all the sense organs, the means by which we come to experience the world. It is tantamount to me closing my eyes and then wondering whether you are actually there or not. Of course, the reason behind this maneuver is to do away with subjectivity in order to get hold of a value-free, objective purchase on reality. And the later post-Tractatus Wittgenstein changed his mind on this about the rhinoceros, and he rehabilitated experience into the production of knowledge. So even though I can never objectively and absolutely prove something to be the case, somehow I nevertheless know it to be the case. The basis of this knowing is my lived experience, a lived experience that cannot be captured by the measuring protocols of positivist science. But this form of knowledge is not certain either, and yet it is all I have. It is in this place of deep uncertainty that I require commitment. And what I am committing to is my sense of things in the moment, my thoughts and experiences as they arise in me, committing to the gestures and responses that are being called out of me. I'm trying to be true in the moment in relation to the person or persons I am sitting with, and with whatever is taking place between us in that moment. The sort of truth I am alluding to in the phrase true in the moment makes no claim to objectivity, nor does it have much to do with the sort of scientific truth that the classical analysts imagine that their interpretations are revealing. The way I am using the term true has more to do with notions of authenticity and sincerity. What I feel and think is not true in any kind of objective sense, yet it is all I have, and so I have to commit to it, and I have to commit to it sincerely. I commit to it in this moment, even whilst it is fully possible and even likely that this will be overturned in the next moment. In contrast to the analytic stance of being deliberately contained and opaque and not reacting or revealing, I am inclined to let my reactions to what is occurring to be more visible, to be known. I expose quite a lot of myself as it arises in the moment. I do this because I think my responsivity is critical and necessary to the therapeutic process. I think it to be a part of the antidote to the damaged capacity for responsivity in the one who comes for help. It is mostly the case that the ones who come for help have difficulties in noticing and naming the responses arising in them, or they have learned to keep them under wraps, or perhaps that capacity to responsivity has atrophied almost entirely. All the so-called hundreds of diagnostic categories in the DSM can be reduced to the simple statement that the ones who come for help have difficulties with relationships, with being in relationships. My responsivity, then, is an invitation to relationship, with all the consequent difficulties of attunement. In this way, the relationship is the crucible in which thoughts and feelings that have been previously banished can come to have a life. In this task, I need to be a real presence for the ones who come for help. I need to be present in order for them to respond to. But I've made my part in the process sound too simple. I said that I commit. True. But I also hesitate. I also prevaricate. I feel fear. I feel caution. But this too is a part of the process. At times I find myself spontaneously reacting even before I know what my reaction is. I come to know it and name it only after it has occurred. I find some consolation in Weick's adage, which goes something like this. How can I know what I think until I've heard what I've said? And to this I would add, how can I come to know what I feel? Or I can only come to know what I feel after I have expressed it or after I have experienced it. What I try to do in the face of muddle and contradiction is to be transparent. And by transparent, I mean to reveal what is arising in me in relation to what is taking place in the room. I'm not suggesting that one should necessarily and continually do this, rather that one should always be open to this possibility. I am not proposing an injunction that says that the therapist must be responsive in this way and transparent. To insist any such thing would be to create another school, and in so doing, reproduce the conceptual error that I think lies at the heart of the creation of any self-declared school. And this is how schools, in a way, invent themselves. It is found through experience that certain forms of engagement are helpful. For example, the tenets of good counselling practice, reflecting back, summarising, listening, empathy, and so on. This is well and good. However, what happens next is that the discoveries get rigidified into rules and instructions, into protocols. Now, the person-centred counsellor must interact in these ways and only in these ways. If they deviate by adding their opinion to the reflecting back, or horror actually offer advice, then they are not being person-centered. Similarly, transactional analysts have to crowbar everything into the reifications called parent, adult, and child. The same is true of the classical analytic paradigm. The transference and its interpretation have become the be-all and end-all of treatment. To do anything other is to act out, to capitulate. In this way, learning becomes rigidified and practice becomes highly constrained by being tied to a limited number of techniques. In this way, we create the illusion of distinct schools. The process is not very different from the way we create and sustain the illusion of distinct cultural groups. In contrast to schoolism, the relational ethos is of the view that there is no fixed universal psychoanalytic methodology applicable to all analyses. So, although I am arguing for openness that allows for spontaneity and responsivity, I am not arguing for a situation in which anything goes. I am circumspect. I try to be thoughtful, but I don't necessarily use thought to corral and subjugate emotion, although I might. My guide in my decision about which course to take can only be my intuition, and so I use it. I commit to it, but my intuition is often wrong, and so I have to be continually open to the prospect of being challenged and corrected. But even on the occasions that the ones who come for help disagree with me and challenge me, it is not the case that I should necessarily give way and let them have their last word. This is the error of person-centered counseling. They relocate the authority and expertness from the analyst into the client. This error, locating authority too completely in either the therapist or client, is born of this linear conception of reality in which cause and effect are distinct and distinguishable from each other. This is the error that the classical analyst is also prone to. They imagine that everything that takes place in the consulting room, including their own thoughts and feelings, are somehow caused by the patient through projection and so on. Similarly, the person-centered counsellor imagines that they can absent themselves from the proceedings through the device of employing an apparently neutral technique of summarizing or reflecting back. So that's the first error. Meanwhile, those who subscribe to a non-linear, co-constructed conception of reality are in danger of falling into the opposite error, where individual responsibility is dissipated and disappears entirely. In this conception, cause and effect are not distinguishable from each other. They emanate from and are aspects of the interactional field. And because this has been co-created and co-constructed, we cannot locate the cause for a set of sequences in any one or other person. We are all complicit in what takes place. Whilst this is true, it is true at a conceptual meta level. It is not how we experience each other and the world. We experience the world from a particular place and perspective. I am embedded in the world. I am embedded in the interactional field, in the clinic, and I cannot step outside it. I'm just going to park this discussion for a minute and go to the notion of authenticity and come back to it. What makes a response authentic? Well, first and foremost, the response should be sincere. By sincere, I mean that the response emanates from and is congruent with my ethical being, my sense of right and wrong. Because the domain of ethics is by its very nature value-laden, it follows that an authentic response will also be value-laden rather than neutral. In advocating for deliberately inhabiting and participating from within a value-laden ethic, I'm immediately at odds with the scientific conception of psychological treatment that the analytic paradigm subscribes to. The natural scientist's attitude in their quest to know things as they are deliberately brackets out values, beliefs and ethics. They deliberately bracket out their subjectivity. Their aspiration is to be fully neutral and not invested in one or other version of things. Now this makes total sense when engaging in a study of minerals. It makes no sense whatsoever when engaging in a study of persons. This is because ethics and values are what make us human. Remove them and we cease to be human. So the kind of relationship I'm advocating for is the I-thou, person-to-person kind, not the scientist-to-person kind, not the analyst-to-person kind, not the psychologist-to-person kind. So I'm going to go back to the error again, as it were. Let me now return to that discussion. The fact that the intersubjective field is co-constructed and co-created does not absolve the participants from personal responsibility. In this, I include myself, the one who tries to help. We are actors and not just acted upon. In this regard, many of the ones who come for help experience themselves as primarily as being acted upon, as bystanders in their lives. The work then becomes in part of daring to voice responses to what is occurring. If the responses are sincere, they will necessarily disclose and express judgments that accord with the person's ethical frame. In this process, they will come to inhabit their humanity. For me, this is what therapy is all about. There is no neutrality here, but expressions of right and wrong, of good and bad, of likes and dislikes, of hopes and fears. Neutrality requires detachment. Meanwhile, I want to promote involvement and engagement. I want to say something about two terms now, objectivity and neutrality. The journalist Ed Vulliamy found himself being criticized for the way he reported on the slaughter of Bosnian Muslims by Serbian forces. He was accused of losing his journalistic duty to be objective because they said he was not being even-handed in his account. He blames Milosevic's supporters and followers for instigating the horrors and perpetrating heinous war crimes against hundreds and thousands of innocents. He names the perpetrators, he names the victims. But in his defense, he says that he is being objective, but that real objectivity does not entail taking a neutral stance towards what one is witnessing. The only way one can remain neutral in such a situation is by cutting oneself off from one's ethical responses to the injustices one is witnessing. When I read this, I was stopped in my tracks. To realize that objectivity is not the same as neutrality changes everything. In fact, neutrality in this sort of situation would require a distortion of objectivity. It seems to me that we have fallen into the same error and we have fallen into the error of making the same conflation in the consulting room. We mistakenly think that to take sides, to have a view, is to lose one's objectivity. But none of us really knows. Each of us imagines that we will know what being better or feeling better will look like. But we don't know this for sure, nor do we really know how to get there. And even when one of us thinks that we are getting there, or at least moving in the right direction, there is no guarantee that the others will agree that this is the case. Is it even sensible to speak of better? Should one speak instead of deeper? We are all stumbling in the dark, and if we are lucky, we will occasionally and accidentally trip over something, and together we will come to know it. To engage in the process of psychotherapy in this kind of way requires courage from all those who engage in it, including the therapist, as we have just heard Foulkes say. I find myself less and less thinking of what I am doing as delivering some form of treatment. I think that the work is more about healing rather than changing or fixing or curing. And I think that the relationship and my way of participating in the relationship is key to this project. Now, all this sounds suspiciously like the corrective emotional experience, the bête noire of the classical psychoanalyst. And the reason it is anathema to them is because the notion gives weight to actual lived relationship over internal structures. It is not the relationship of the analyst that cures or helps, it is the interpretation. And this, to give weight to the actual relationship, goes against the turn taken by Freud, alluded to earlier. But many other psychoanalysts did not follow Freud into this turn, Ferenczi and Kohut amongst others. For them, the corrective emotional experience is itself the therapy. I tend to agree, but I want to introduce some caveats and put it a bit differently. My hesitation is this: as soon as I have an intention to produce a corrective emotional experience, I will immediately instrumentalize my responses. I'll be mobilizing my responses to create certain ends, certain effects. Consequently, my responses will no longer be authentic, but instrumental. Further, because all encounters between humans are emergent and unpredictable, there is no way of knowing in advance what it is that I might do to produce this corrective emotional experience. We will all have had experiences in which some inconsequential remark or gesture evokes an unexpectedly powerful response. Now, I recall a moment some years ago that took place near the end of a session. I said something, I forget what, and suddenly the person in front of me found herself full of tears and sobbing without knowing why. What I do remember is her saying that she had just been hit by a depth charge. And whatever it was we hit remained hidden. What we were able to register was a disturbance as it broke through the surface. It felt like a kind of a moment of grace in which we were visited and moved by something precious yet unknown. But I cannot set out to try to foster this kind of experience of intimacy. This kind of intimacy arises through and out of sincere and authentic exchange. But even so, I do have ends in mind somewhere. I do wish for the ones who come for help to feel better in some way, to be more fulfilled in their lives. And although this is my wish, I cannot get there in any directed and deliberate way. I enter the conversation. I involve myself with my being. I have to trust that this little will go a long way. Kierkegaard's well-known aphorism captures why psychotherapy cannot be an instrumental endeavor. Lost it, it's not there. Okay. He says, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Having understood a particular life or a particular therapy by looking back on it, we mistakenly think that we can instrumentalize this understanding to determine future outcomes of other lives and other therapies. We then write manuals and codes of practice. But I am overstating it. Surely and hopefully the reason that my practice has shifted is because of the ways that experience has changed me. I have learned something from experience. The situation is one of paradoxical tension, a tension that cannot be and ought not to be resolved. I try to immerse myself in the moment, even whilst, unlike Bion, I am full of memory and desire. I immerse myself in the moment and trust that I will manage to stay true to the turbulence that follows. My argument has been this. that more important than what the therapist does is the kind of person the therapist is and the way the therapist is. This work is in the territory of being, and being with rather than of doing. In conclusion, the detached stance of the classical analyst is congruent with and true to the scientific conception of classical psychoanalysis. And although many practitioners have taken the relational turn, I think they have done so only partially. They might have shifted allegiance to a relational conception of life, but their form of practice is discordant with that conception, as it continues the ways of the detached scientific analyst. I give the last word to Hoffman, who said this: I think the reports of the death of the classical stance are highly exaggerated. On the contrary, I agree with Greenberg that the asocial view of transference is alive and well in contemporary psychoanalytic practice.